The mop bucket squeaked against the linoleum as David Calloway pushed it down the empty hallway of Ashford Elementary. And for the third time that week, he stopped outside room 1014 and listened through the door before he made himself walk on. Inside, his daughter was being laughed at. He couldn't hear the words clearly, only the particular shape of group laughter. The kind that has a target, the kind that pauses just long enough for someone small to feel it land. He gripped the mop handle until his knuckles paled, and then he did what he always did. He kept moving. He emptied the trash can outside room 115. He wiped a water stain from the drinking fountain. He did not go in, because going in would mean explaining who he was, and explaining who he was, and explaining who he was would end everything he had built for her over the past 4 months. And hey, welcome back. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. By the time the final bell rang and the halls filled with the stampede of small sneakers, David was in the supply closet, coiling an extension cord. When Principal Marcus Kane's voice cut through the intercom system requesting that custodial staff report to the front office regarding a parent complaint, David didn't think much of it. Parent complaints about the maintenance staff were common enough. A locker that wouldn't shut, a bathroom that smelled like bleach for too long. He wiped his hands on his gray uniform pants and walked toward the office, unaware that in 11 minutes he would be standing in front of Marcus Kane while the man loudly, deliberately, and incorrectly informed him that his employment at Ashford Elementary was terminated, effective immediately in front of 2 teachers, a parent volunteer, and his own daughter, who had just been called down from her classroom to wait for her father, the janitor, to walk her home. Lily stood by the office window with her backpack straps in both fists, watching a man she loved be humiliated by a man in a blazer. And she did not yet understand that within 72 hours, that same man in the blazer would be sitting across a conference table from her father in a very different room, in a very different set of clothes, with absolutely nowhere left to hide. 3 weeks earlier, David Calloway had walked through the same front doors, carrying a folder of paperwork under his arm and introducing himself simply as Dave. Not David Calloway, founder and majority owner of Calloway Dynamics, the logistics and automation company whose software quietly routed nearly a fifth of the packages delivered across the country every single day. Just Dave, a single father looking for part-time custodial work so he could keep his daughter close, keep an eye on the school she'd be attending, and keep his own name out of any conversation that might make her life harder than it already was. Lily had lost her mother 18 months earlier in a car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside Denver. And in the aftermath, David had made a decision that surprised nearly everyone who worked for him. He handed the day-to-day operations of Calloway Dynamics to his longtime coup, a woman named Priya Anand, who had been with him since the company was 4 people in a rented office above a laundromat. And he told her he needed 6 months, maybe a year. He needed to be a father before he could be anything else, and he needed to do it somewhere nobody was watching him do it. He chose Ashford because it was 3 miles from the modest rental house he'd bought under a shell company, because the district had a strong record with grief counseling resources, and because this detail mattered more than he ever said out loud. Lily had picked it herself off a list of 6 schools. Pointing at a photo of the reading garden behind the library and saying, quietly, that it looked like somewhere she could breathe. He had not planned to work there. That decision came later, after the first week of drop-off, when he noticed the particular way 3 girls in Lily's class angled their bodies away from her at the cubby wall each morning. The way one of them, a sharp-eyed girl named Brooke Halston, seemed to organize the excluding with the quiet authority of someone twice her age. He noticed it because David Calloway had built an entire company on noticing patterns other people missed, and grief had not touched that particular skill. It had only sharpened it, aimed it, until it pointed permanently at his daughter. He could have called the school, he could have scheduled a meeting, used his name, used his money, used the kind of leverage that makes administrators sit up straighter. He chose not to, for one simple reason. He did not trust a single meeting to tell him the truth. He had learned that lesson running a company of 4,000 employees, that people behave one way when the founder is in the room, and an entirely different way when they believe no one of consequence is watching. If something was wrong at Ashford Elementary, he wanted to see it the way it actually existed, not the way it was performed for a wealthy parent. So he applied for the open custodial position under his middle and mother's maiden name, David Calloway, becoming simply Dave Ellison. References quietly arranged through a property management company. He owned 3 shell layers removed from Callaway Dynamics, and within a week he was pushing a cart of cleaning supplies down the same hallway his daughter walked to class. Invisible in the particular way that adults who mop floors and empty trash cans become invisible to the adults who run institutions. It did not take him long to understand the culture of the place. Principal Marcus Kane had been at Ashford for 6 years, the kind of administrator who had mastered the performance of leadership without ever quite arriving at its substance. He was warm in newsletters and distant in hallways. He knew the names of donors and school board members with photographic precision and struggled visibly to remember the names of the custodial and cafeteria staff, several of whom had worked there longer than he had. He liked to be photographed at assemblies. He did not like to be interrupted during his morning coffee, a fact the front office staff had learned to navigate around with the practiced caution of people managing a mood rather than a colleague. Beneath him, the hierarchy sorted itself, the way hierarchies always do, quietly and without anyone writing the rules down. Certain parents got called back within the hour. Certain teachers got their supply requests approved without question. And certain children, David began to realize within his first 10 days, got protected, while certain other children got managed. A word he heard more than once in the staff break room, always applied to the same small cluster of kids whose parents didn't sit on the PTA board and didn't write checks for the spring fundraising gala. Lily was one of the managed ones. He watched it happen in slow motion, a campaign so subtle that any single incident would have sounded reported alone, like nothing at all. A seat saved and then unsaved the moment she approached. A birthday party invitation list read aloud during indoor recess with her name conspicuously absent, followed by careful laughter that made the exclusion sound accidental. A group project where her name was quietly removed from the final poster before it went up in the hallway, her contribution simply erased, as if she had never spoken in that classroom at all. He raised none of it. Not yet. He filled trash cans. He fixed a squeaking door hinge outside her classroom so he'd have a reason to linger near it twice a week. He learned the rhythms of the building, which teachers actually walked their hallways during the passing period, and which ones stayed at their desks, which yard duty aides watched the playground, and which ones stood near the fence, scrolling their phones, which counselor's door stayed genuinely open, and which ones stayed shut behind a laminated sign that said the same thing. He also began, without telling anyone, to document what he saw. Not out of paranoia, out of the same instinct that had once told him a supplier was quietly padding invoices 3 years before the audit proved it. Patterns don't lie. People do. The teacher who noticed first was a woman named Rosa Delgado, who taught the grade below Lily's and had no obligation whatsoever to pay attention to a child who wasn't in her classroom. She noticed anyway the way certain teachers simply cannot help noticing. And she noticed something else too, the quiet, unhurried competence of the new custodian. The way he crouched down to eye level when a crying kindergartner got lost near the gym. The way he always seemed to be exactly where a small crisis was unfolding, 5 minutes before an adult with an actual title arrived to manage it. "You're good with them," she told him one afternoon, watching him walk a limping second grader to the nurse's office instead of paging someone to come get the child. "Most people who do this job just do the job." "I have a daughter here," he said, which was true, and which was also the only piece of information he offered. Rosa didn't push, but she watched him a little differently after that, and when she began quietly raising concerns in staff meetings about the exclusion pattern building around a small group of third-grade girls, she found she had, without quite planning it, an ally who saw the hallways more completely than anyone else in the building, because he was in them constantly and because no one thought to perform for him. The small conflicts accumulated the way David had known they would. A permission slip for a class trip that never made it into Lily's backpack, though her teacher swore it had been handed out to every student. A reading group reassignment that moved her out of the group with the 2 girls she'd started to trust, no explanation offered beyond scheduling needs. A lost art project that turned up eventually, crumpled at the bottom of a recycling bin behind the art room, days after Lily had stopped asking about it, having learned already, at 8 years old, not to expect anyone to look for the things that mattered to her. He kept a private log, dates, times, what he'd witnessed directly and what Lily told him, unprompted. In the small, unguarded moments after school, when children sometimes say the truest things without meaning to reveal anything at all. The turning point, when it came, arrived through Brooke Halston. though not through any cruelty of her own making, entirely through the mother behind her. A woman named Denise Halston, who sat on the parent advisory board and had over several years cultivated a relationship with Principal Kane, built on donor lunches and a shared understanding that certain families' comfort mattered more than others. It was Denise who complained loudly and often that her daughter felt targeted by accusations of exclusion, framing her own child as the victim of oversensitive classmates, and it was Kane who listened, nodding, taking careful notes about a problem that, in his telling, seemed to center entirely around the discomfort of the Halston family rather than the child being frozen out day after day at the cubby wall. David watched this unfold from the margins of the building, invisible in his gray uniform, and understood with a cold, settling clarity that the institution was not neutral. It had a shape, and the shape bent toward whoever could make the most noise in the principal's office. He still didn't intervene as David Calloway. He kept documenting instead because he had learned in boardrooms, in supplier disputes, in one very expensive lawsuit early in his career, that righteous anger without evidence changes nothing, and evidence without patience gets dismissed as coincidence. He needed the pattern to be undeniable before he moved, and he needed more than anything for his daughter to never know that her father had staged any of it. She deserved a childhood, not a case file. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in early October, 3 weeks into his employment, when Lily came home with a note from her teacher stating that she had been disruptive during a group activity and would be moved to eat lunch separately from her class for the remainder of the week as a consequence. David read the note twice at the kitchen table while Lily picked at her dinner in silence. And when he finally got her to talk, gently, without pressing, what emerged was not a story about disruption at all. It was a story about being excluded from a group project so completely that when she'd quietly asked to be included, the teacher knew, overwhelmed, eager to keep Denise Halston's daughter's table calm, had labeled her the problem instead of asking a single question about why. That was the moment David decided the documentation phase was over. He didn't storm into the school the next morning as himself. He did something quieter and, in hindsight, far more consequential. He requested, as Dave Ellison, the janitor, a private meeting with Rosa Delgado after hours. And he told her, carefully, what he'd observed over 3 weeks, cross-referencing dates with his own maintenance logs, which had inadvertently placed him near enough to witness or overhear a dozen small incidents that, individually, meant nothing, but together, painted an unmistakable picture of a child being systematically frozen out, while the adult in charge of her classroom protected the comfort of a donor's daughter over the well-being of an 80-year-old with a dead mother and a father who worked nights. Rosa listened, and then she did something David hadn't expected. She told him she'd already begun raising the same concerns and had been quietly redirected twice by Kane, who preferred, in his words, to let the kids work it out themselves. She had emails, she had a paper trail of her own, going back further than David's 3 weeks, because Rosa had been watching this exact pattern repeat itself with different children for 2 years and had simply never had enough weight behind her voice to make the district listen. Together, without either of them fully realizing what they were building, they assembled something close to a case. What David did next was the quiet, undramatic action the moment demanded. He placed one phone call, not to a lawyer, not to the school board, but to Priya Anand, his coup, asking her to quietly and discreetly confirm through the district's public procurement records, who sat on the Ashford Unified School District's advisory board, and whether the district's grant funding that, as it happened, Callaway Dynamics had anonymously contributed to 18 months earlier through its community foundation, specifically earmarked for counseling and anti-bullying programs, had actually been allocated the way the district's public filings claimed. The answer came back within 2 days, and it was worse than he expected. The grant money, over $300,000, intended for expanded counseling staff and a formal anti-bullying curriculum, had been redirected with Kane's sign-off toward what the internal budget line vaguely called campus enhancement, which turned out, upon closer inspection of vendor invoices, to mean a renovated media room used almost exclusively for board meetings and donor events. The counseling position the grant was meant to fund had never been filled. The curriculum had never been purchased. The single part-time counselor the school did employ had been quietly told, the year before, that her hours would not be increased despite mounting requests from teachers like Rosa Delgado, David sat with that information for one full night before he acted on it. Not because he was uncertain, but because he understood that once he moved, there would be no quiet path left. He was no longer simply a father protecting his daughter. He was about to become the anonymous donor whose money had been misused, standing in the same building as the man who had misused it. And the moment that became known, everything would change for Kane, for the district, and for the fragile, ordinary life he had built for Lily under a name that wasn't his own. He decided the reveal itself would happen on Kane's terms, in Kane's own office, because David Calloway had learned long ago that the most effective accountability rarely needs raised voices. It only needs the truth arriving somewhere the person responsible can no longer redirect it. The termination, when it came, arrived almost as a gift, though David didn't recognize it as one until later. Denise Halston, frustrated that her complaints about her daughter's unfair treatment hadn't produced a satisfying resolution, escalated things by falsely claiming that the school custodian had been overly familiar with children on the playground, specifically citing an incident where David had crouched down to comfort a crying student who had fallen near the swings, an act any reasonable adult would recognize as basic decency, and which 3 separate staff members, including Rosa, had witnessed without concern. Kane, eager to placate a donor family and unwilling to investigate a complaint that would require him to actually walk the halls he rarely visited, terminated David on the spot. In the front office, in front of 2 teachers, a parent volunteer, and Lily herself, who had been called down early for pickup and now stood by the window watching her father be accused, in careless, dismissive language, of something ugly and untrue. "Effective immediately," Kane said, not quite meeting David's eyes. Already halfway through composing the email he'd send to Denise Halston, confirming the matter was handled. "I'd appreciate it if you'd gather your things quietly. We don't need to make a scene in front of the children." David looked at his daughter's face, confused, frightened, trying and failing to understand why the adults around her kept getting this so wrong, and he made the only decision left that mattered. "I'll need 5 minutes," he said, his voice even unhurried, carrying none of the heat Kane clearly expected. "And I'll need you to call whoever handles district compliance, because effective this afternoon, I'm no longer applying for reinstatement as your custodian. I'm here as David Calloway, and I believe you're already familiar with the Calloway Family Foundation's grant to this district." The silence that followed was the kind that changes the temperature of a room. Kane's expression moved through several stages in the span of a few seconds: irritation, confusion, and then, as the name fully registered, something closer to vertigo. He knew the name. Everyone on the district's finance side knew the name, because the Calloway Family Foundation's contribution, 18 months earlier, had been the single largest private gift the district had received in a decade, and the foundation's contact had, until that exact moment, been an anonymous entity represented only by an attorney and a signature line. "I don't understand," Kane said, though the color already draining from his face suggested he was beginning to. "You will," David said. "Give me a week. I'd like to meet with you, the superintendent, and whoever on your board approved reallocating $300,000 of counseling funding into a media room renovation. I have the documents. I imagine you'd rather review them somewhere quieter than this office." The investigation that followed moved with the particular speed institutions discover when the person asking questions can no longer be dismissed. David's attorneys, working alongside the district's own outside counsel, requested and received the full grant expenditure records, cross-referenced against vendor invoices, board meeting minutes, and critically, a set of internal emails Rosa Delgado had preserved over 2 years, documenting her repeated ignored requests for additional counseling support. The picture that emerged was not one of a single bad decision, but a pattern, sustained across multiple budget cycles, of prioritizing donor comfort and campus optics over the basic well-being of students who didn't have parents wealthy or persistent enough to force the issue. Denise Halston's complaint, once actually investigated by someone with no incentive to protect her comfort, collapsed within days. 3 staff members corroborated that the playground incident had been nothing more than an adult comforting a fallen child. The false accusation, layered on top of the mismanaged funding, became its own separate finding in the district's report, a demonstration of exactly the kind of unequal treatment David had spent 3 weeks quietly documenting, now with an institutional record behind it instead of just his word. Kane's resignation came 11 days later, submitted before the school board could formally vote on his termination. which several board members privately admitted was the outcome they'd have reached anyway. He did not go quietly into obscurity or ruin, David had insisted, in his one private conversation with the superintendent, that this remain a matter of professional accountability rather than public humiliation. Kane lost his position and, per district policy, would be barred from any administrative role in the state system pending a full review. What happened to him afterward was, David told Priya later, no longer his concern. Anger had never been the point. The counseling program that Grant had originally funded was rebuilt within the semester, not simply restored, but expanded, with 2 full-time counselors and a formal anti-bullying curriculum developed in direct consultation with Rosa Delgado, who was promoted to lead the initiative district-wide. David funded an additional unrestricted 3-year grant through the Callaway Family Foundation, this time with oversight built directly into the term's quarterly reporting, an independent audit clause, and a requirement that funding decisions affecting student welfare be reviewed by a committee that included classroom teachers, not just administrators and board donors. He asked that his name be kept off the announcement. The foundation's name appeared. His did not. He never returned to Ashford Elementary as a custodian, though he did return, once, on a quiet Thursday afternoon near the end of the semester. Not as David Callaway, the foundation donor, but simply as Lily's father, picking her up from a school that finally, imperfectly, felt like somewhere she could breathe. She ran to him across the pickup lot, backpack bouncing, and told him, breathless, that Brooke Halston had said hi to her that morning, actually said hi, unprompted, and that a new girl named Sophia had asked her to sit together at lunch. He kept, on his desk at Callaway Dynamics, a small item he'd taken from the supply closet on his last day working there under the name Dave Ellison, a worn wooden door wedge he'd used every morning to prop open the door of room 114 so Lily wouldn't have to struggle with the handle while carrying her backpack and her lunchbox at the same time. It wasn't a symbol of what had gone wrong. It was a reminder of the version of himself he'd been for those 3 weeks, invisible, unhurried, paying attention to things no title required him to notice, and of the plain, uncomfortable truth he carried out of that building and back into every boardroom he ever sat in afterward, that the measure of any leader isn't how they treat the people who can advance them, but how they treat the people they believe will never know who's watching. He never forgot which version of himself had actually changed something. It wasn't the billionaire. It was the janitor who stayed quiet long enough to see the truth clearly and then refused to look away from it. If this story touched something in you, hit that like button. It helps this channel grow. Subscribe if you haven't, because we share stories like this every day.